Back in 1957, one Brazilian farmer would have a number of strange experiences before coming down with a mysterious illness. He would first just see weird bright lights through the windows while getting ready for bed one night, but soon he would be trying to catch these lights, chasing them around his farm. Before long, a UFO would fly in, disabling his tractor before landing right in front of him. 4 creatures would exit this odd machine, running over and grabbing a hold of him. They dragged him aboard their ship, where they would strip him, smear strange liquid on him, then gas him before putting him in a room with only a bed. After a while alone, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen walked in the room, completely naked just like him. This is when his close encounter became much, much closer. Antônio Vilas-Boas was born into a fairly well-off family in the area of São Francisco de Sales, a municipality in the west of the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. Even today, this area has a population of less than 7,000 people, and it's mostly agricultural land. His parents owned several plantations in the area, growing sugarcane, corn, and soybeans. They also had a good number of cattle, with Antônio helping herd them on horseback at a very young age. As an introduction to a later interview, Antônio would say, "I have 2 brothers and 3 sisters, all of whom live in the same region. 2 other brothers died. All the men in my family work on the farm. I'm single, healthy, and I work a lot. I follow distance courses and study when I can." Antônio was 23 at the time, and he lived in a small house on one of these plantations with his older brother. This is where several strange events would take place in just a 2-week span, forever changing Antônio's life. His first strange sighting would happen on October 5th, 1957, just a bit after 11 p.m. Once some guests left a small dinner party that Antônio and his brother were holding, the two decided to go ahead and get some rest, heading off to bed. Being a bit hot, Antônio got up to open one of the windows, seeing a bright white light up in the sky. He yelled at his brother to come take a look, but he didn't want to get out of bed. Not thinking too much of it, Antônio went back to bed too. A while later he would wake up, and still curious, he looked back out the window. Not only was this light still there, but it looked like it had gotten much, much closer. Startled, Antônio would slam the shutters, waking up his brother. They would both stand there in shock, peeking through the shutter boards as the light came close to the ground, and it seemed to move around their farm for a while before flying back up into the sky where it quickly disappeared. And they never were quite sure what was producing this light or what the object could have even been. They quickly went back to life as normal. They were busy people and always had a lot of work to do. Antônio's family owned a gas-powered tractor, something that even today only 1 in 4 farmers in the area actually own. And they would keep this tractor going nearly 24/7. The work hands would use it during the daytime, and Antônio or his brother would use it most nights. Antônio said he actually didn't mind the schedule, as it was a good way to beat that Brazilian heat. And it would be on one of these work nights that he would have his second encounter, just 9 days after the first. On October 14th, around 9:30 or 10 p.m., the 2 brothers were out plowing one of the nearby fields. It was then that a very similar bright light appeared around 300 feet above their heads. Antônio would say that at first it appeared like a, quote, red star, but as it came closer it became an almost blinding white light. It then again came close down to the ground on the opposite side of the field. The light was so bright that Antônio couldn't tell what it was actually coming from. He hopped off of his tractor and started to head towards it to get a better look. The brother, unwilling to do so, stayed behind and just watched. As Antônio approached this object, it lifted up and floated to the far side of the field. He again went after it, and when he got close, this time it lifted up and moved back to the spot he had just been a few moments before. According to Antônio, this game of chase repeated itself, quote, no less than 20 times. Finally discouraged, he returned to his brother's side. Describing what he saw next, Antônio said, "The light kept still for a few minutes longer in the distance. Now and again it seemed to throw forth rays in all directions, the same as the setting sun, sparkling. Then it suddenly disappeared, as if it had been turned off. I am not quite sure if this is what actually happened, for I cannot remember if I kept looking at the same direction all the time. Maybe for a few seconds I glanced elsewhere, so it may have lifted up and disappeared before I had time to look back again." The two retreated back into the house for the night. deciding that work could probably wait till later. The next evening, Antonio returned to the field to get some of the work done that they didn't finish the night before. However, he was alone this time, as his brother refused to come out there with him. At one point during this night, he was using his tractor's headlights to see while tending to the field. It was then that he saw a reddish light in the sky, flying towards him incredibly quickly. Antonio said, "So quickly that it was on top of me before I could make up my mind what to do about it." It suddenly stopped roughly 160 feet above his head with a bright pinkish light shining down on him. It was so bright that he couldn't even see his tractor's headlights anymore. He looked up and saw a large egg-shaped object with 3 antennas sticking out from the front, which were all wrapped in a red light. Terrified, he ran back to his tractor, looking back to see 3 tripod-like legs extending from the underside of the craft, with it then gently landing about 60 feet away. He then noticed a rotating dome-shaped light on top of this object. This light was first red, but as the craft slowed down and started to land, it turned into a green color. The 3 antennas looked to be made of some kind of metal that started white at the base and then ended in a point. Unsure of what this large machine was, he hopped on his tractor and tried to drive away from it. But he only made it a few feet before the engine quit and the headlights turned dark. Turning around, he could now see 2 figures climbing down a ladder on the side of the object. Antonio jumped off his tractor and tried to start running, but the freshly plowed ground was soft and difficult to get around in. Before he could make it back to his house, his arm was grabbed by a small humanoid figure in strange clothes. He violently shoved the entity back several feet and turned around to start running again. However, within seconds, 3 more large creatures had caught up to him. They all latched onto him, and despite all of his struggles, they managed to carry him back towards their craft. It was now that he was able to see just how strange these creatures actually looked. They all appeared to be wearing tight-fitting but soft, evenly striped gray material, and there also looked to be thin metal strips strengthening certain areas. The material went right up their necks and then connected to some kind of helmet which hid everything but their eyes. The eyes appeared human to him, but seemed to maybe be a little small. He thought this could have been due to the glass on the helmet. All of them had light-colored eyes, maybe even blue, but he couldn't be sure because of the strange lighting. He also thought that their helmets looked too tall, almost being twice the height of a normal helmet. On the very top middle of it, he could also see 3 round silver tubes sprouting out. One was on the center, and then there was one on each side. He described them as a bit smaller than a garden hose, and they were smooth and bent backwards. The tubes went down their necks, with one going right down the spine. The other 2 connected to the suit a few inches away from their armpits. These hoses and the suit fit together so seamlessly that the tubes couldn't even be seen as a lump under the outfit at all. He didn't know what any of these were for, and just didn't understand what he was seeing. They approached the bottom of the ladder, with the opening of the craft now several feet above them. In this light, he was now able to make out even more details about his captors and their uniforms. Each one of them looked to have some kind of red reflective badge on the front of their waist, and these were the size of a pineapple slice. The center of these badges had a strip of silvery metal that joined onto what looked like a claspless belt. He didn't see any buttons or pockets either, with these suits very tight. There were no wrinkles or creases even able to be seen. Antônio even looked around their shoes and couldn't see a seam or a hem anywhere. The shoes seemed to be made as the same material as the rest of the suit. The soles, however, did look to be about 3 inches thick and arched up a bit on the front. It's then that he noticed that their feet appeared to be quite large, nearly twice the size of his. He thought this was odd, as they were all around his height. They also seemed to walk very stiffly, but they did have a large and swift gait. As they grabbed for the ladder, he could see that they did have 5 fingers, but they didn't seem to be able to bend them that far, not looking like they could touch their own palms. But this didn't seem to hinder their movements either, as they had no problems grabbing onto and manipulating him. The 3 began to haul Antônio up the ladder, while the first shorter entity stood nearby watching them. This ladder seemed to be fairly flexible. As he tried to resist, it bent and shifted. He kept grabbing onto it, but every time, one of the creatures would pry his hand back off. It didn't take them all that long to get him up into the hatchway. Later, Antônio commented, "All seem strong, but not so strong that had I fought with them one at a time, I should have been afraid of losing. I believe that in a free-for-all fight, I could face any single one of them on an equal base." Once they were all inside, he saw the hatchway quickly seal shut behind them, with not even a seam visible. He found himself in a small, square, white, metallic-looking room. The room was completely bare, other than a few recessed lights that shined as bright as daylight. Out of nowhere, another doorway opened up, with Antonio being led inside. This room was also pretty bare, but he could see what he believed to be an odd-shaped table and a couple of stools fixed to the floor. And they all looked to be made of the same material as the walls, with them also being this same kind of white metal. 5 figures then entered the room and forcibly started to undress him. He shouted at them and tried to resist, but communication didn't seem to be happening. And the sounds they made back at him just didn't have any resemblance to human speech. He wasn't even sure if he could speak like that if he tried. Antonio would describe the sounds as somewhat like animal grunts, but some were short and some were longer sounds. And some even sounded like several grunts combined together and ended in a sort of tremor. This strange speech terrified Antonio, and it sent shivers down his spine. He finally stopped resisting and let them finish whatever they were doing. He later said, "They obviously couldn't understand me, but they stopped and stared at me as if trying to make me understand that they were being polite. Besides, though they had to employ force, they never at any time hurt me badly, and they did not even tear my clothes." They then started to rub down his entire body with a thick, clear, odorous liquid. Once they were done with him, he was led into another doorway. This one was a bit different. It had strange red scribbles drawn above it. He had no idea what it meant and couldn't make sense of it. He was followed by 2 of these creatures, with the door again closing flush to the wall behind him. The 2 carried a couple of strange goblet-shaped glass vessels with nozzle-like glass tube protruding from one end. They then pressed the glass tubes to his chin for several moments. When he looked down, he could see that they had filled each vessel about halfway up with blood. He didn't even feel any pain at first either, with it only later starting to itch and burn. They stopped briefly before placing the goblets in different spots and filling them up to the brim. After a couple of minutes, they left the room with his blood, leaving him all alone. He started to explore his surroundings, walking over to what he thought was the low table. On closer inspection, it appeared to be some kind of cot or bed with no legs or headboard. It was covered in a very soft, grayish material, and it was made of something that reminded him of styrofoam. After a while, he guessed an hour at this point, he decided to make himself comfortable and lie down. Sometime later, puffs of gray smoke started to come out of holes about halfway up the walls. It quickly dissipated into the air and left a smell like, quote, painted cloth burning. It was so bad that he eventually ran to the corner of the room and threw up. Gathering himself back together, he turned around to see that the door had opened back up without him noticing. Then he was shocked to see a woman walking in, coming right towards him, completely naked just like him. She slowly walked towards him, with Antonio now thinking that she must have been the shorter entity he saw earlier. But he only guessed this because she was about the same height. He was entranced by her beauty, but he felt that it was a different sort of beauty than he was used to. Her hair was smooth, but not very thick. It was parted in the center, and it was a sort of platinum blonde color, almost as if it had been dyed by peroxide. She had big blue eyes, which seemed a little longer than round. To Antonio, she looked like an Arabian or Oriental princess, and he was amazed to see no makeup on her face. Her nose was straight, not pointed or turned up, and also not too big either. He did notice that she had very prominent cheekbones that made her face appear a bit wider than normal. At one point, he even felt the cheekbones and noticed they were soft and fleshy and not as hard as he imagined. Her face then narrowed towards the chin, which gave her a lower jaw and almost pointed look. Her lips were very thin and nearly invisible. The ears were a little small, but other than that looked ordinary. Antonio would glance down, later saying, "Her body was much more beautiful than any I have ever seen before." She was slim and perky, with a thin waist, flat belly, and thick hips and thighs. Her hands and feet did seem a bit small and narrow, but still nothing out of the ordinary. Her skin was very white and fair, and he would notice freckles all over her arms. It's then that he saw something unexpected, saying, "Another thing I noticed was the hair in her armpits was bright red, nearly the color of blood." Antonio even talks about her smell, with him stating that she doesn't wear perfume and just smelled like a woman. It was then that his fear and nausea completely disappeared, with him now in a state of completely uncontrollable arousal. He wasn't sure what caused this, but thought it might have something to do with the liquid spread in his body or the gas that made him puke. Now he felt like this beautiful woman was staring at him like she wanted something, walking towards him in silence. She pressed herself against Antonio, with him now beginning to get quite excited. He says that it's then that he forgot about everything else, and he pulled her close to his chest. They would perform a variety of acts together, going at it for about an hour before she pulled away and got up to leave. He was actually flustered at the quick goodbye, later saying all they wanted was a good stallion to improve their own stock. And although this encounter was a little weird, he did very much enjoy it. He thought it was odd that the woman refused to kiss him, instead preferring to bite his chin, but he did, however, just puke a little while ago. She also made strange animal growling sounds, which was kind of a bit off-putting. She never did say any words to him either, leaving the room when another figure opened the doorway. Antonio said, "I was angry, but then I resolved to pay no importance to it, for anyway, I had spent some agreeable moments. Some of the grunts that I heard coming from that woman's mouth at certain moments nearly spoiled everything, giving the disagreeable impression that I was with an animal." One of the figures then returned, bringing his clothes back to him, and they were all intact, but he couldn't seem to find his lighter. He wasn't sure if they took it or if he lost it in a scuffle earlier. He was led back into the room with the table and stools, with the other entities now sitting around and communicating with each other. At this point, Antonio felt pretty calm. He didn't think any harm would come to him. He started to look at his surroundings, trying to remember every detail he could see. He kept looking for windows, but only ever saw the smooth, hard metal walls. His companion from earlier would then walk in the room, talking with the other figures in their strange grunting language. She seemed to be ignoring him to some degree at this point, so he continued to look around the room. He then realized that he had nothing at all to prove that any of this had actually happened, looking around for something to sneak away with. Then Antonio saw something resembling a box-shaped clock. It had a dial and a hand, but he wasn't sure if the hand actually moved. He picked it up, surprised to find that even though it was quite small, it weighed nearly 5 pounds. One of the taller figures then jumped out of his seat, rushing over and ripping the strange box out of his hand. It then pushed him back a few steps before placing the box back down the spot that Antonio had taken it from. He walked back towards the wall and stood against it. He didn't feel afraid of them, but he wasn't looking for trouble either. He tried to see if he could scrape the wall with his fingernail, but they were so smooth that he couldn't even get any metal to flake off. After several moments, one of the figures rose from his stool, gesturing to Antonio to follow him. Before walking out, though, the woman from earlier pointed to her stomach and then towards the sky. He first thought that she was saying that she was going to have his child and wanted him to go back up to the sky with her. The figure opened up the hatchway but didn't go down, instead stepping to a small platform to the side of the door. When Antonio stepped on, the entire top of the ship seemed to turn. He and the figure were now looking at a couple of small square metal rooms. He was unsure of what they were used for, but he guessed that they might have been the control rooms for the flying ship. The ship turned again, and now they were looking at the front, where the 3 large antenna-looking apparatuses were attached. They looked to be made of the same metal as the rest of the craft, but he couldn't be sure. They were also each topped with round red lights that made the surrounding metal look red hot, but he couldn't feel any heat coming off of them. The light on the center antenna was also much larger than the lights on the sides. They started moving on the platform again, and this time he noticed small square reddish lamps embedded in the hull, providing their path with a bit of light. They then ended up next to some very thick glass, which he thought may have been some kind of crystal. Looking through it, it seemed a bit murky, but he thought that this must be the observation window simply because it was the only window-type opening he even saw. They went back to the hatchway, with the figure now pointing at Antonio, then gesturing to the ladder. The entity then pointed to himself and then back up to the sky, the same way the woman had done earlier. Getting the meaning, he stepped back down the ladder before looking back up at them. He was gestured at to move farther away before the ladder retracted back into the ship. Then the hatchway would once again close, giving the ship the smooth appearance. The small dome light on the top of the craft began to spin again while emitting a stunningly bright green light. He began to hear something similar to air passing through small holes, or maybe some kind of vacuum cleaner. The craft then began to rise off the ground, with the 3 landing legs retracting back into it, again leaving no trace that they were even there to begin with. As it rose higher, the sound grew into a howling noise, and the light on top spun faster before turning into a bright red color. It stopped about 100 feet above his head. The lights grew brighter, and the sound grew louder. The center of the ship then started spinning at an incredible speed. The entire object then changed the direction it was facing so fast that it made a sound like a bullet being fired. It then suddenly shot off southward, disappearing from sight within just a few seconds. Returning to his tractor, he decided to open the hood and see if he could figure out why it wouldn't start earlier. This is when Antonio became convinced that these creatures had somehow sabotaged his tractor. He would find that somehow the battery cables had been pulled off, and he had no idea how this had happened, as he had been right next to it whenever he had spotted the craft earlier. He put the wires back on and drove back up to his house. He noticed that it was now about 5:30 in the morning. He believed that he must have been aboard the ship for at least 4 hours. Completely exhausted, he slept through the whole day, awaking around dinner time feeling fairly refreshed. At first, he didn't really feel the need to tell anyone about his encounter, but he would start to change his mind over the next couple weeks. He first started having vivid nightmares about being abducted by the creatures once again, often getting hardly any sleep at all. But then after a few weeks, he started to have the opposite problem, becoming excessively tired and sleeping more than usual. After about a month of either not enough or too much sleep, he finally decided to go to the doctor. There they would find some strange purplish sores and marks on his body, but other than that he seemed perfectly healthy. Another month would go by and he just never seemed to get any better. And now he was also becoming nauseous, had headaches, loss of appetite, and even a burning sensation in his eyes. He would go back to the doctor with the wounds now looking a bit different as well. The purplish skin was now more of a reddish color and seemed to be harder than the surrounding skin. They were painful when touched and would sometimes discharge a white yellowish liquid. This doctor then diagnosed him with radiation poisoning. It was then that either the doctor or Antonio contacted Jose Martins, a journalist that had placed an ad in a paper looking for people with UFO experience. He would come out to interview Antonio and quickly became very interested in his story. But even though he thought it was interesting, he thought that many people would think that Antonio was either crazy or a fraud if he went public with his story. After hearing that, Antonio said, "Let those who consider me such come to my house and examine me. This would help them to immediately determine whether I can be considered normal or not." After hearing this, Martins decided to contact a friend of his, Dr. Olavo Fontes of the National School of Medicine of Brazil. Dr. Fontes then performed an examination on Antonio himself. He was completely puzzled by his story and his physical and physiological symptoms. He was convinced that Antonio didn't make his story up either, noting that he was actually a bit reluctant to tell him the details. He also felt that if this was simply a made-up sexual fantasy, he could have done a lot better with the story. After finishing the examination, he concluded that Antonio had indeed been exposed to a large dose of radiation and was now suffering from mild radiation sickness. It seems that he came to this conclusion after using a pretty new device at the time, a Geiger counter. Fontes also noted that he didn't find any signs of mental illness and even checked to make sure that he wasn't superstitious or into mysticism. It would also be around this time that a Brazilian UFO magazine would publish his story for the first time. And after reading this report in the magazine, the local army base would summon him in to questioning, and this was only 4 days after his appointment with Dr. Fontes. Antonio claims the army didn't believe him at all and basically just told him off. He said to them, "I will do whatever you think is appropriate, gentlemen, and I'm prepared to testify before the civilian or military authorities." The army then subjected him to a battery of physiological and psychological tests before ultimately just sending him home. Dr. Fontes, who originally wasn't quite sure what he thought of Antonio's story, suddenly believed a lot more after hearing about his interview with the army. He then wrote a letter bringing the case to the attention of the Aerial Phenomenal Research Organization, or APRO, in the United States in 1958. But it would be some time before they decided to come down to Brazil and investigate for themselves. Fontes would even be interviewed, explaining why Antonio's story took so long to get more attention.
He took also our advice, because in the end we said to him, your report is not going to be published because it's too fantastic. And he said, "Why do you think that my report can't be published?" And we said to him, "Because it's too fantastic and most people will believe that you are lying." And his answer was, "Well, if you think it's best, I'm going away from my town and not going to talk to anyone." He did just that. He went back and his report was not printed. He talked with no people.
Over the next few years, his story would appear in a couple more Brazilian magazines, and the story started spreading a little bit farther. In 1966, the famous Lorenzen couple from the APRO finally managed to track down Antônio. They flew from the US down to Brazil to do a story on his experience for a British magazine. Their opinion was that, quote, the Boas affair was in actuality a breeding experiment not emotionally acceptable to most. Dr. Fontes, who kept an eye on this case, decided that more people needed to interview Antônio before too many years had passed, so he took matters into his own hands.
But now, another group of investigators went to the town where this man lives and talked to him, got his report, but a very poor one because after 7 years he had forgotten many things. And after this, I decided to publish the report of this case.
However, the story would take several more years to start circulating around the North American media. One of the first to make an observation on Antônio's encounter, Jared Diamond, who would write in his book, The Third Chimpanzee, it is utterly impossible for living organisms as separate evolutions to sexually unite their genes, unless they were of common genetic background. He continued, saying that if we couldn't mate with a chimp who was genetically very closely related to us, then how are we supposed to believe that a completely different life form would be capable of producing offspring with a human? Even if it was to create some kind of hybrid species, Diamond wonders why they wouldn't just use their superior technology or create them with surrogacy instead of breeding them. He finished by writing, since to all appearances and apparently functions, the female who approached Boas was a human being. It's the most logical conclusion that can be reached. Then in 1978, Antônio agreed to interview on a Brazilian TV show. There had been many different versions of this encounter spreading like rumors, and he wanted to set his story straight. After seeing this interview, Bosko Nedeljkovic, an interpreter and translator at Inter-American Defense College, came forward with information he felt might have something to do with Antônio's abduction. He told the UFO researcher that during the 50s and 60s, the CIA had manufactured UFO incidents as part of Operation Mirage, which usually references intelligence-gathering missions using the Mirage F-1 aircraft. Bosko knew of this because he worked for the CIA from 1956 to 1963 in Latin American countries under the umbrella of the Agency for International Development, or AID. He even claims that he knows about Antônio's encounter because he was present at the scene when it happened. Looking into this, the researcher, Rich Reynolds, would find records showing that Bosko was indeed working for AID in Brazil during Antônio's incident. Bosko said that he was part of a 9-man helicopter team responsible for abducting civilians and subjecting them to a number of psychological warfare experiments and hallucinogenic drug tests. Specifically, his team consisted of a doctor, CIA agents, and Navy personnel, and they were working in the Minas Gerais region of Brazil, the same state that Antônio lived in. This was also a large helicopter, and it was equipped with some kind of metal cubicle around 5 feet long and 3 feet wide. Although Bosko wasn't sure what this was exactly used for, he did know it had to do with the psychological warfare experiments. After this interview, Reynolds managed to track down another AID worker who claimed to have more details. According to the anonymous AID worker, when the helicopter started to descend on Antônio's farm, the men began spraying the area with a chemical meant to, quote, alter the perception of those that breathed it in. The men were wearing breathing apparatuses, and then they drug Antônio onto the helicopter where they subjected him to even more drugs meant to severely alter his sense of reality. This is when they put him in the small metal cubicle before sending in a prostitute of Asian origin. The man didn't know why this had been a top-secret project or what they hoped to achieve, but he believed that the purpose of it all could have just been to see how far they could bend a person's mind into believing something had happened a certain way. Another UFO researcher, Ralph Blum, didn't quite believe the CIA abduction theory and had some of his own thoughts to add. He said, Vilas-Boas speculated that the clear liquid was an aphrodisiac. To my mind, the logic of the story suggests that it was a germicide of some kind, and that the smoke was a chemical that permitted the alien to breathe without her helmet. Blum also believes that when the woman gestured to her stomach and then to the sky, she was actually saying that she was going to return back to her home planet where she would bear the child without him. However, researcher Peter Rogerson doubts that either of these theories are actually true. He notes that in the November 1957 issue of the periodical O Cruzeiro, a similar story to Antônio's would make an appearance. Although Antonio claims his encounter happened a month before this story was printed, he didn't actually come forward with it until several months later. Rogerson suggests that he borrowed details from this story as well as some from George Adamaski's contactee stories in order to create his own. He also believes that the prejudiced assumption that any rural Brazilian farmer had to be an illiterate peasant had a lot to do with his credibility, as he, quote, couldn't make this up. Rogerson also points out that many ufologists also didn't realize that just the fact that Antonio's family had a tractor meant he was well above the peasant class. He said, "We now know that AVB was a terminally upwardly mobile young man, studying a correspondence course and eventually becoming a lawyer." At which news, the ufologists who had considered him too much the rural simpleton to have made up the story now argued that he was too respectable and burgerous to have done so. Over the years, Antonio grew a little tired of repeating the story. He kept to himself most of the time, not denying that the incident happened, but also refusing to do any more interviews. He finished his studies, receiving a law degree and becoming a practicing attorney in the city of Formosa. He also went on to get married and have several kids, but it is said that he apparently never did share many details of his encounter with them. He said a story like this would just upset his wife, who was a very jealous person. He lived his life for the next decade or two, but in the late 80s he came down with a strange unknown illness. He was even taken to the USA for treatment, but unfortunately this didn't help much, as he passed away in January 1991. Although no doctors have confirmed this, Antonio's nephew and much of the rest of his family are convinced he died from complications caused by the radiation poisoning he got all those years ago. His nephew said, "I lived with him a lot. This story, even today, is taboo for the elders of the family, because it brought a lot of discomfort. The uncle died of a radiation that hit an artery at the base of the brain, which caused him to vegetate for a while until death. No one explains where the radiation that led to this picture came from." Antonio's encounter would actually happen several years before the famous Betty and Barney Hill abductions, a case that was often considered the first of its kind. On another note, he never needed any hypnotic regression to remember his abduction either, something very prevalent in the Hill case. At the time of Antonio's abduction, the UFO news in Brazil was said to be a fertile topic, with many stories already circulating in the media. Many suggest these other stories are what put the idea of UFOs in Antonio's head to begin with, but either way, his story gained much more attention than the others and went on to become one of the first alien encounters to receive worldwide attention. And even though Antonio never spoke much about his encounter, he insisted that it was true and stuck by his story until his death. He never did gain any profit and never became very famous, but many people believe that he very well could have if he wanted to. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you like seeing videos about these kinds of topics. I've gotta say, this case was pretty different, but it still had some interesting parts. And actually, the UFO in this case reminds me a lot of the UFO in the Socorro, New Mexico case. So be sure to check out my video on that one if you haven't seen it yet. Also be sure to leave a comment. I'm always interested in hearing what all you guys think about these topics as well. And this still is Tier 3 of my alien abduction incident and encounter iceberg. I'm just slowly going through it to make sure I can get as much detail as I can out of each of these cases. Oh, and before I go, I should also mention that you can listen to this in podcast form too, and that's available on most podcast platforms. For any of you wanting to show your support, I have opened up a Patreon and a channel membership account where you can get videos early and ad-free. So be sure to check that out too. This was Matt, and I want to believe.